What's going on, guys? Dan with PC Tech Hustle coming at you with another video, and today we got part 2 of the how to build a $1,000 Ryzen gaming PC. So if you haven't seen part 1, I want to point you off into the top right corner so that way you can go check that out and you can see why we got all these now parts sitting up in front of us. But if you've already watched part 1, then you are here for the build, and that's what we're about to do coming at you right now. Alrighty guys, and I want to mention, if you're new here and you enjoy PC builds like this or any other PC tech related content, make sure you hit the subscribe button down below and don't forget to tick that bell notification icon. That way you're informed of whenever I drop my latest content. So let's talk about the parts that we have here on the table. And as you might notice, there are a couple things here that are different from the PC part picker build list that we had originally set up in part 1. So although there are a couple things different, there really aren't many. So as mentioned, this 2060 Super is going to remain the same, but as mentioned, the client needed some Wi-Fi, so we ended up going with the Aorus B550, which I'm actually pretty excited about because this will be the first time I've touched a B550, but because a lot of the B450s are coming off shelf, we needed to get a board that had built-in wireless, and it was basically almost impossible to find in a B450 format. So we had to go up on price a little bit, and it kind of did lead us to busting the $1,000 budget, though not by much if you remember the part 1. And then as I was discussing things with the client too, they decided they wanted to go up in storage a little bit more. Originally we were settling on 500, but then we landed on a 1 terabyte NVMe P1 Crucial drive. So I think, you know, with the extra money spent on that, which was like another $30-ish or so, this definitely settles them in well, and having tons of storage for games, even Modern Warfare, will still have plenty of space left over. So I was just kind of letting them know, hey, this will kind of future-proof you a little bit more, and they decided to go with this. So I think that was a good move on their part. So again, that kind of bumped the price a little bit more, but you know, we're still well under even $1,100 at this point. So as mentioned too, I'm not going to cover all the parts because we definitely went deep and heavy into that in part 1. So as mentioned, this is going to be a build that's centered around a tutorial style as opposed to kind of a build montage with some music and stuff. So this is going to be kind of like what you guys have been asking for. I polled you guys and you wanted to see some of this, and I figured, well, you know, this is a good video to kind of change some things up. So let's get the camera closer here and start unboxing some of these components, all of them brand new. I haven't even touched them, and let's see what we got inside and start building this $1,000 Ryzen gaming PC. Alrighty guys, so we got the table cleared off now, and before we jump into doing some unboxings here and getting things going, I wanted to just cover my toolkit I use. This is the iFixit toolkit. Now, they're not sponsoring this video. I'm just simply stating that this is a fantastic toolkit if you're looking to get into PC building. This kit basically offers everything you need as far as basically any type of screw head that you can find. Got spudgers and all that good stuff, and it's all magnetic, so it's made PC building a dream. I didn't originally have one of these, and I'm mad at myself for not getting one sooner. So I just wanted to throw that out there, as this is a fantastic kit, and it's going to help you in the very long run with PC building, because you're going to thank yourself later so many different times. So go get you one of these if you're really looking to do a lot of PC building. So let's start with the components first, and we got the motherboard that we're going to start with. All right, so and with the motherboard, it also makes for a good little, you know, makeshift platform to build your rig on, at least get some of the initial components on the motherboard. I usually typically build on it mainly because, well, you can't ground anything, even though this is a wood table, but say if you're working on metal, it's a kind of a giving surface, so if you're pushing on it, you're not potentially breaking anything as you're putting some forces, like basically, you know, with RAM and CPU installed and stuff like that. Let's open this guy up. First time I'm seeing a B550 board at all. So I'm glad it's a Aorus brand, because it's definitely my favorite brand. Okay, so every motherboard typically will ship with an anti-static bag like this. So nothing out of the ordinary here. Got a piece of tape to undo. Backside. For what's considered a budget option motherboard, this thing, it feels loaded. Now, it's not the super budget option, but B550 is supposed to be your budget option board, but ooh-wee, look at that board. Man, I think I like this better than my Z390 Master. This thing looks gorgeous. Very awesome. So one thing, keep your little plastic stuff on while you're building. Helps prevent fingerprints, you know, just keeps things nice and clean and tidy. So we'll make sure we're doing that. And also with the anti-static bag, I typically like to save these in case I ever say I decide to get a different board and resell it. I can put it back in the bag, and just good to have these around if you need it. But before we get to building here, let's just check out what other components we have inside the box that we'll need. I don't think there's gonna be many. We have the Wi-Fi antenna, you know, we'll get to that later, so I'm just gonna leave that there. Some extra SATA cables. What is this? This is looks like an RGB cable. Some more SATA cables, some Oris labeled Velcro straps. I'll probably use those at some point somewhere, so I'm gonna set these off to the side. What else we got? This will help us connect our front panel connector, so we'll put that off to the side. But aside from that, just some stickers and stuff. I was actually looking for screws for M.2's NVMe's, but I guess they're probably already attached to the board. So let's close the board back up, put the anti-static bag back in there. All right, so box all closed up. Now we got ourselves a building surface. So I'm gonna put it a little closer here because we'll be working on the CPU here next. All right, so on with the CPU because that'll be the next component we install. And actually I'm gonna shove the motherboard off to the side for a second while we unbox our CPU here. We got the Ryzen 5 3600 non-X variant. Now, if you've seen one of my other videos, which I'll put in the top right corner, we know these suckers run pretty hot. So we have a aftermarket cooler that will be pairing with that, which you guys will see here in a minute. Pull out the CPU, which is always just right here on the side. There we go, Ryzen 3600. Set that off to the side. Now, as I mentioned, we're not going to use the cooler, which it ships with the Wraith Stealth cooler that's in the box. So it's going to stay in the box because we're not going to use it. So let's just tuck that back in there. Set this box off to the side. All right, let's bring our motherboard back in. All right, guys, so this is going to be basically the most delicate part of any PC build. Well, any AMD Ryzen build, but probably any build because CPU part is the most delicate part. So on AMD, we all know. And again, this tutorial is not going to be on how does every component work, what is its function within a PC. This is strictly, we're going to assemble things and put it together. We're going to take this CPU out of the plastic packaging. Open it from the bottom like this, real simple. Get your fingers in there and just make sure you get a good grip on it and pull it out. Not a problem. Okay, so as mentioned, this is the most delicate part because the golden pins that we don't want to bend in the process. So make sure these stay intact. So in order to get this into the socket safely, we're going to open the retention arm right here. Make sure it's fully open, just kind of give a little tug there on the right side. And what we're going to look at here is first we're going to grab our CPU again and we're going to look for this golden triangle, and that's going to point, that needs to match up with the motherboard where there's a triangle facing. That is actually down right here in the top left hand corner. So we're going to flip our CPU around and line that up, and actually on the other side too of the CPU there is another golden triangle right up here in the corner as well. And what we'll do is, another note with Ryzen is the CPU is always installed reading Ryzen from top to down like this. So that's another rule of thumb that you can use when installing a Ryzen CPU. So what we'll do here is we got it all pretty much lined up, okay, and drop it in. And you can give it like a little wiggle, make sure everything's good, but this should require zero force and should just drop right in. So then after we got it in, we don't feel like anything's out of place, we're going to push down on our retention arm. And there we go. CPU is installed. All right, guys, so as mentioned, you know, that's probably gonna be the most nerve-wracking part of any installation for either it be Intel or AMD. I think AMD is a little bit more nerve-wracking just because the pins are on the CPU itself and it's easy to potentially drop the chip and bend some pins, but we made it through safely, and I think if you follow exactly what I just did, you shouldn't have anything to worry about. So next what we're gonna do here is install the RAM, mainly because the cooler that we have, being the Hyper 212 Evo, can potentially kind of create some interferences with the RAM. So I want to get that installed first and then we'll work on the cooler. Okay, so here we go. We got our G-Scale Ripjaw Black Series, 3600 megahertz, cast latency 18. This is going to be a great fit RAM for a Ryzen 3600. So let's open up this guy real quick. One, out. Just stick your finger underneath and push it out. That's all you got to do. All right, so here we have it. These look pretty good. Now with RAM installation, it's really hard to mess this up. So honestly, just pay close attention and you should never have a problem. As you see with each of these, there is a notch where there's a space missing that will line up with the motherboard down here on the motherboard. So we got the motherboard turned sideways here. Basically, all you want to do is open up the second and fourth slots on your motherboard. Typically, these are always the same. So your primary slots are your 2 and 4 and your secondary are your 1 and 3. Though, if you're not sure, reference your motherboard manual, obviously. Don't just jump into it, but I've never really seen anything that didn't use slots 2 and 4 as the primary. So what we do is, now that we've got the DIMM slots open, we're gonna match up the slot with the notch, and everything should just basically fall into place. Now, but this is where you kind of need to apply a little bit of force, but honestly, it's not much. Just watch your retention arms on your DIMM slots as we do this, and you shouldn't have a problem. We're gonna push down evenly on both sides and just push it down until those arms come up. There we go. Follow the same process with the second one. Now, another thing to note with memory like this, where it's got a label printed, and it kind of makes it even easier for you to know which orientation the RAM needs to go, because that's what's legible. You're reading it face on, so it makes it a little easier to kind of understand the orientation. That one didn't click so much, but it's in there. All right, so now we've got everything installed, being the RAM and the CPU. Now let's flip the board back around, and actually before we go into the CPU cooler, we're actually going to install our NVMe in the primary slot for that as well. Okay guys, so now we are in close on the NVMe M.2 slot. This board has 2 of them, I believe, maybe 3, probably just 2. Let me double check the back. Yeah, just 2, but yeah, that's plenty enough. Even better that we went with a 1 terabyte. That way we get better, more effective use of our M.2 slots. So this is where we actually have to use a screwdriver for one. So what we're gonna do is gonna pull this screw off that holds the heatsink on to the motherboard. So let's grab our iFixit kit and a small bit screwdriver. I think this should be good enough. Yep, there we go. So we're just gonna back this off. There we go. All right. Now with the screw, it won't actually come out, which is nice. So you can't lose it. I really like that design. So what we have here is just kind of a basic piece of aluminum. It's got an adhesive backing here that we're going to seal down on our M.2 NVMe. That way it'll have some better heat transfer up to this heatsink, and airflow will help cool it down, keep it nice and cool. But additionally, we have another screw here on this standoff. So I believe we're in the right slot. But you can see there's different variations of sizes of M.2 NVMe drives. Ours, I think, will accept this one. We'll see if we have to move that standoff to a different location or not. So let's grab our drive. We got our Crucial P1 NVMe solid state 1 terabyte. All right, so kind of like with the RAM, right? The NVMe drive has a notch that is cut out that should meet up with the motherboard, and let me see if I can give you a better shot of that real quick. Kind of hard to see, but in here there is a notch right here on this more bottom edge, and actually it's easy to kind of know where that is based on just looking at the NVMe drive itself. It's going to install just as it reads with the label up. Really, you can't mess this up. You just gently find where the notch is, right? Push it in horizontally. Should hear that click like that. And then you're pretty much good to go. Now it's kind of spring loaded. Now one thing I just messed up that I forgot to do was I forgot to back out the standoff screw down here. So let's just take the drive out to be safe. We'll make sure we're not messing anything up. So obviously do that first. But at least now we know we don't need to move the standoff. This is where it needs to go. Pull that little tiny screw. Now don't lose this screw. It is tiny, tiny, tiny. Another reason why a magnetic screwdriver is very handy. So let's try that again here. Line up our notch. All right, we're lined up. Push towards the RAM this way. Clicked in. Okay, it's spring loaded standing up, so that's what this little tiny screw will help us keep it down. Place one finger down on the drive as you tighten down. Make sure you're hitting it at the right angle. There you go. Okay, now literally just tighten it till there's a very, very, very mild amount of force. You don't need to over tighten it. These things don't have moving parts. There is absolutely no reason to over tighten anything here. So now back with our heatsink, we're gonna put this back on, but first we're gonna peel our adhesive here for the thermal pad that is going to interface with the drive and help create some heat transfer, so that way we can keep this drive nice and cool. Same kind of process. We'll line up where the hole is, bring it down. Really can't screw this up, guys. And then drop it right where it was before you took it off. Screw it down. All right, so now we got CPU, RAM, and NVMe drive installed. Again, now let's tackle that cooler. Alrighty guys, so we're gonna push the motherboard off to the side again real quick to get our cooler prepped and ready. Which we got here is the Hyper 212 Evo Black Edition, which can't recommend these coolers enough because they have withstood the test of time. They're great coolers. As mentioned, I got a video where I had to use one of these, not the Black Edition, but had to use one of these to keep a 3600 common cool. Let's open this guy up. Should just be a little peely up here. All the contents out. get this cooler prepped and ready to go. All right, so we'll have our hardware box on top, and cooler should just slide out. There we go. Very nice. Set that off to the side a little. Man, I like the black edition. This is actually the first time I've touched on the black edition, but very nice looking. I love that brushed aluminum look on top. Looks great. This is very good looking cooler. Remember, don't forget to peel that off. All right, so let's set this off to the side and get things ready to go. All right, guys, so I'm not gonna cover fully how to install a Hyper 212 just because that might not 100% apply to your scenario. Maybe you're not even using a 3600, you're using a different CPU, or maybe you decided on a different cooler. So I'm not gonna really cover a lot of the detail in that. We're gonna get it installed. But one thing I did wanna cover that applies basically to all Ryzen builds here is the installed mounting brackets here that come pre-applied to the motherboard. So there's 4 screws and 2 plastic brackets here that hold this on. Some of the stock Ryzen CPUs actually just use a mounting mechanism that clips to that. That would be Ryzen 7 series, but for us, we have to actually take that off. And actually, if you're using the stock cooler, you'll have to take this off as well because the stock cooler will screw in place of these screws. So we're just gonna zip this off real quick and get underway with the Hyper 212 install. Now guys, don't lose these, hang on to these, because you never know if you decide to change coolers or resell your board or whatever, that you'll want the stock mounting mechanism. It's definitely a good resale factor, and if you have a cooler that actually utilizes them, then you're definitely going to want to hang on to them. So for the Hyper 212, it doesn't use any of the stock cooling components, so we'll take off the back plate that those plastic pieces held on and work on getting our Hyper 212 installed. All right guys, so as mentioned, we're not going to fully cover the entire installation of the Hyper 212, mainly because your situation may not apply to that. You might be able to pick up some bits here if yours does, but right now we're just prepping the Hyper 212 backplate, which all coolers will have some form of backplate. Even the stock cooler had one, which we saw that we removed, but we're going to spin it around back here real quick, and really we can just lay it in. So this is for the AM4 socket. And there we go, simple as that. Flip it back over so that way our screws are sticking up. Maybe grab one of them so they remain sticking up, and we can work with it. Onward with the install. Alright guys, so we basically got our mounting mechanism ready to go, and as I mentioned, obviously your situation may vary depending on what cooler you decide to go with. Again, I can definitely always recommend the Hyper 212. But next we have our thermal grease install, or thermal compound. This actually ships with the cooler, so you don't necessarily even have to worry about getting some. Honestly, almost any stuff will do. There's a lot of online debate about what's the best, blah, 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 blah. But the variance that you'll get between different thermal pastes is almost completely, within margin of error. So I don't typically, unless it's my own system and I'm trying to achieve the most crazy overclock ever, I'll go for like a high-end stuff. This will be completely fine. And I'm going to just apply a very generic method here, which is just apply like about a pea size. So just get it close, probably good. Just make sure you don't drip it all over the motherboard, and there we go. That's it. Whether that's the way you want to do it or not, or like to do it, well, that's your opinion, and I've never had a problem with this. So, all right, so probably the only one weakness of the iFixit kit is the screwdriver is pretty small. They might make, I'm not entirely sure, they might make some longer shafted ones, but for the Hyper 212, it kind of makes it really difficult to actually tighten it down. So what we're doing here is we're just slowly tightening down the cooler in a crisscross fashion, trying just to get it to grab. So that way we apply even mounting pressure to the CPU socket. Again, this is kind of why it's good to have that motherboard box. That's kind of gives a little bit, because we are putting a fair amount of pressure right now onto the board. Nothing overly aggressive, but kind of makes it a little bit more forgiving working on a giving surface like this. So again, just crisscross mount until basically, like with any real CPU mount, cooler mount, just screw down the screws until they stop. No need to go crazy on it. All right, we're nearing the end here, and what you'll likely hear is those springs kind of tightening down. They kind of make an audible noise. That's actually what happens with the stock Ryzen coolers as well, since they're spring-loaded screws, just like the Hyper 212 here. I want to make sure we got a good, even mounting pressure. These 3600s definitely run hot. Okay, so what we'll do here is I'll spin it around so we can kind of see this angle. So we got down here CPU optional and a CPU fan. So we got our CPU fan here ready for install. Well, we almost did. The clips just fell off, but we're ready to get this onto the cooler. These things are kind of a pain. Some of the older Hyper 212 models used a different mechanism. Not too bad. Just got to clip on the fan hole and just pull it taut, and it's pretty much going nowhere. And there's actually some rubber dampeners on the other side of the fan that'll actually help you if you're using this cooler to know which orientation it needs to go. So then we'll spin the motherboard here real quick. As mentioned, we have CPU fan, which is our gray header, and CPU optional. We're gonna go with CPU fan. Plug in this 4-pin. Can only go one way. Just line up the orientation of the cable and the header, and then just kind of stuff the cable. Actually, what I like to do here is I hate when I know it says warranty void if removed, so it's kind of hard to see that, but this looks so ugly. So sorry, taking a chance on that. What can really fail on the cooler? The fan. So whatever, if something happens, we'll just replace the fan, but I'm pretty sure we're just fine. So now we've got the cable all nicely tucked. When you're looking at it head on, you basically can't even see it, which is nice. But yeah, now we've got basically all the hard stuff done. Now we just got tedious things to do, like cabling and getting this installed into the case. All right guys, so, and I forgot to mention before you go any further, this is kind of the stopping point that you want to take to do some post testing. Obviously, probably a better idea to not mount the aftermarket cooler, but maybe just mount the stock cooler, just so that way you can just do some basic testing. You want to make sure, you know, your RAM's recognized, it gets to a full post, meaning it gets into BIOS, etc. We're not going that way, but definitely that's what I suggest. That's what I normally do for builds that I'm not necessarily recording and not taking you through the process like this. But make sure you do that so that way your parts are tested. You don't go through the hassle of putting everything up into the case and then find out you have a failure or something like that. So do as I say, not as I do. All right, let's grab the case and pull it in so we can work with it. Now this is basically one of the most basic NZXT cases you can buy. It's the H510 non-I version. The I version is the one that has the RGB implementation and controller. It's also quite a bit more expensive, and really what we're going for, if you notice, with the black RAM, the black cooler, the non-RGB case, we were going for a kind of minimalist approach so we can spend all of our money on performance. So we're gonna open up this case. I've worked with it before. It's real simple. It's just a thumb screw up here. Again, your case and your mileage may vary. There we go. Tempered glass. Now, keep your plastic wrap on the glass while you're handling, just while building, you know, keep things nice and tidy. Set that into a safe place. Looks like underneath we got, actually what I typically do on my builds too is pull the back panel off as well. So that way we can expose the back, oop, sorry for the noise, and work from the back as well, so that way we have plenty of working space. And here we go. We'll pull out our hardware that comes with the case. Actually, that was, I guess you guys didn't see that. That was down low in one of the hard drive bays, but this is the hardware we'll use for mounting stuff. And got a few more things underneath for cables, but yeah, we're pretty much good to go. So let's get that motherboard mounted. All right guys, and typically, usually when I'm doing builds, I have the case standing up just so it's more of a better visual aid for you guys. But to make it easier, honestly, lay the case down and get it so that way you can use gravity to your advantage and not have gravity actually pulling the parts off of the motherboard tray. So what I'll do real quick though before I do that is just untie our cables that we have wrapped up here. NZXT does a very good job, even with their kind of more basic cases, which this is considerably more basic. I always end up twisting these things the wrong way at first. Okay, there we go. And one little tip, these twisty ties that usually hold some things on like that, these actually are good for cable management if you don't have zip ties laying around. So you can even trim them. You can probably use this twice. So just a little pro tip there for you. All right, got these cables out. We are going to basically, all right, so let's just lay those in there and flip the case around and lay it over. So what I'll point out here real quick too with a decent case is there's always a standoff with a decent case. Not always, but most decent cases provide this, is a middle standoff that kind of helps you line up your motherboard. So that way you kind of just drop it in and then start screwing things down. Now with a standard ATX motherboard like what we have, it has 9 screws on it, 3 top, would be normally 3, but in the middle, but we're going to use the middle standoff, and then 3 down below. So and with a good case like NZXT, they actually have that pointed out, and we have all of our standoffs pre-installed already. So you have ATX 3 there, 3 there, 3 there. So we're good to go. Now, one thing I will point out as well, before you put in your motherboard, if you have a motherboard, say you didn't go for the exact same parts that we did, that doesn't have a IO shield, you want to install that first. And you've probably seen that in many of my videos before, but you're not going to get that in after you install the motherboard. So make sure you put that in first. But for our case, or I should say our motherboard, we already have a pre-existing IO shield. So we're just going to drop this sucker right in. Now is probably a good time though to peel off your peely on the IO shield. In fact, I'll try to do that while it's in the case because I'm going to get my hand all over it, but that's a good reason why it's there, right? And also you can grab the motherboard by the cooler now that we have it nice and secured. So that'll help you install motherboard as well. So gently just bring it in. It's a little tight in this case because this is the biggest motherboard that this case supports. Actually, I feel like we're getting caught on the fan of all things. I think we might have to back out the fan just to get this in a little bit. Oh wait, there we go. Coming in. Well, no, I'm gonna have to take the fan out because our IO shield is very large and I can't lift up the motherboard to get it over the top of that center standoff that is kind of sticking up a little further. That's supposed to help us here. So hang on, let me do that. All right guys, I was able to get it. I just had to kind of hit it with a different angle, and as mentioned, that middle standoff definitely helps a lot, so I kind of had to finagle my way, but didn't scratch anything along the way. But the great thing about that is that's why I love that middle standoff, is like everything is basically in alignment now with the screw holes that we need to now take care of. So this part is probably one of the most boring parts about PC building, is just redundant driving in screws here, so we'll maybe speed things up or skip while we take care of that. So I guess before we speed things up, one thing I will mention is, just like basically anything else with your hardware components, hit it at a diagonal first. That way, so I just screwed down the top right screw. I'm gonna go down to the bottom left and get that. So that way it kind of just keeps everything nice and lined up. And then you don't really even have to think about anything at all. And again, too, with screwing things in, the motherboard has traces in it. So you don't wanna crack it. You don't wanna over tighten it. So literally just get it just about hand tight. That's all you need. It's got 9 screws in it. It's not going anywhere. So you don't have to hammer it down with a lot of torque. Nice. Perfect. Now that's how it's done. This is looking really good. I love the black kind of stealth look of this build. So next we'll flip the case up and it's on to power. Alrighty guys, actually before we do power, there's usually a couple other things I like to wire up prior to power, because I usually run the power connections over the top of those, and that's all the front panel stuff. So what we'll do here is we'll run through that real quick. Just some pro tips for you. So that's what we had previously on the back side that I showed you. So that is these cables, what I previously showed you that we had on the back side that we disconnected. So we've got the HD audio here. This will go on the bottom left side of the motherboard. This I think is a USB-C. Yeah, this is a USB-C connector, which I'm not sure if our board has. We'll have to double check. I'm gonna put the cap back on. Then we also have front panel and NZXT. Again, this is where they shine. They include the front panel connector, kind of like almost like a USB connector. I forgot. This case actually only has front USB 3.0, but typically your USB 2.0 front panel connector looks just like this. This makes basically connecting the front panel like extremely simple. Most cases don't have this. I think some are evolving to that, but typically, as you see how many cables that are actually included here, about 5 or 6, they're each individually ran. And I don't know why case manufacturers can't do this more often. So again, kudos to NZXT. Another reason why I chose them, because they have great case design. Even on a minimalist case here that only cost about 50 bucks, we're getting lots of good features. So we need to run these cables. The first one is gonna be, I think what we'll focus on is the front panel audio connector that needs to come through the basement here. We have a little gap here. So I'll spin it around so you can see what I'm talking about. So we're just basically gonna run it up through the basement here. So you can actually do it this way. It's not tangled in anything else. We're just gonna tuck it right up here. And your HD audio basically always connects to the same spot, which is this header down here. Now this is probably one of the harder items to capture with a PC build, but basically what you need to do is you need to take a look at your cable orientation. With the HD audio, it always has this odd pin that is blocked off. Typically it's usually pretty easy. Most of the time what I see is the HD audio text sitting upward, but actually for this motherboard or this cable orientation, it's actually going to sit downward because we have the second pin on the bottom left here missing. So we have to flip this cable over to compensate for that. Actually, I kind of like that because I think the extra text is just kind of doesn't look as clean. And as long as you got the pins lined up, this can only go in one way. Boom, it's in. We'll tidy up the cable a little bit. What I'm thinking is we'll bring it down under, and when the power supply goes in, it'll look pretty good. So next we have USB 3.0. Make sure we have that routed pretty nice and not tangled in the back. And for this board, I believe there is only one header. Some have some usually up here on the right hand side and then down below. Again, this is supposed to be a more budget oriented board from Aorus Gigabyte, so we only have one USB 3.0 connector, and it's usually called a 20 pin, but this also only goes one way. There's a notch, just have to line it up with the notch on the very top side of this header. There's an opening for this notch to go into. So the good thing about, again, with NZXT is they provide this in a very flexible flat cable, which makes actually a bottom mount 20 pin USB 3.0 connector so much easier, because some are very thick and not easy to work with. So what we'll do is we'll just kind of try to run this as clean as possible. Zip it in there. Unfortunately, the cable is just going to kind of stick out like that. We really don't have any other option. So I may like put a zip tie right here to kind of pinch it together, at least make it look clean. But that's what I typically don't like about boards that have bottom USB like that, because you can go get like a 90-degree adapter and they'll make it look a lot cleaner, but we don't have that, so we're not going to do it. For the other connectors, what do we have left? Front panel is going to be our next. I'm pulling it out from behind the case. Kind of the same thing, and we'll be connecting front panel over here. Now with the board, it has this wide arrangement of front panel potential connections. It's this big kind of header here, but let's tuck this up through for the moment, because we have to kind of orientate that in regards to how the motherboard actually wants to receive those front panel connections. I don't think our header will cause us problems, but we'll see. I think they actually provide an adapter, a split off adapter, which we may end up having to use here if our panel connections don't line up. Here, I'll show you what that is. So NZXT again is thinking of potential problems. So here's what I'm talking about, is where all those power cables could end up. You know, they meet into one if you got a good case that'll just accept it, but motherboard. It's very possible we're gonna have to use this and then split the cables off. I'm going to take a quick look at that. I can't see it from here, so we'll continue on with that in just a second. I was able to just take the front panel. I check the diagram on the motherboard. There's usually a pinout diagram on the board. It's sometimes really hard to see, and that's why I had to cut the camera, because I could not see it. Also, if you still can't see it, then you can go to your motherboard manual and check there. But the front panel connector connects directly into the motherboard header just fine. All the pins line up, so we are good there. I mean, that typically is kind of a pain in the butt part of building a PC, because you have to connect those tiny little cables. Again, here's the adapter, these tiny little things into those singular pinouts. So it's usually a pain in the butt. So looks like Aorus and NZXT work well together. So now we can move on to power. Next being power, we're gonna just move the case off to the side for a second while we open up our power supply from EVGA, the 700 watt BR. I can't recommend EVGA more for power supplies. So I'll grab this little sticker off the top. All right, oops, took off some of the box. We got here's the power cable, shorty, like I think it's only like a 3-foot power cable. So that out of the way, let's pull this guy out of here. Oh, here are the screws I mentioned that come usually with almost any power supply that I've ever encountered. Now we can get it out. All right, here we go. Get this plastic wrap off. And there we have it. So let's get this guy into the case, and we will be very well nearing completion on this build. All right, so let's spin the case around to the back side. We got the power supply taken out of the box, ready to go, cables unbundled. Again, yeah, this is kind of what you run into when you don't buy a modular power supply, but you still got a pretty good quality supply. It's just a matter of, usually when you spend a little more, you get more features. So we got a lot of cables to deal with, but the good thing is we can just shove it under into the basement. So now with power supply, the common thing to do these days is to mount them upside down. We have plenty of ventilation down below in the basement. Plus we also have a filter that will help keep the power supply free of dust. So I'd say whenever possible, mount them downward facing. That way it can suck in its own fresh, cool air from below the case. Plus, on cases that don't have power supply basements like this, it'll look a lot cleaner. So we're gonna put this guy in here. Really only one way to do it. It's kind of just pulling out because of the cable, so not spin it around so we can tighten it down into its place. Line up the screw holes, there, 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 and there. So we got this one lining up. We'll zip this guy in, and then again, let's go diagonal so we can kind of suck it to the chassis. There we go. And then just drive the remaining two in. One down here, and the last one over here. Doesn't really get too much more simple than that. That's simple. The fun part of the power supply install is running all the cable mess. So typically what I start with is we need to run our CPU power. So find the one labeled CPU power. Typically with a power supply like this, it'll just be a 8-pin. Fancier, more robust, more featureful power supplies will have dual cables for CPU. We don't need that for this motherboard because it's just an 8-pin. All right, so now we got a wider shot of what we're up to here. So we're gonna take our CPU power, again, just being an 8-pin connector, and we're gonna shove it up into the our top right, which will be, if you're looking at the front of the case, top left, where CPU power is typically normally situated, unless you got a super high-end board, but we don't. So next we want to grab our 24-pin cable. Again, with like a cheaper power supply, I hate that they do this. I don't even understand the point, but there's the 4-pin that kind of splits off from the main 20. Just kind of reattach it there. May have to do it again, but here's where we have to use kind of some thought on trying to orientate these cables a little bit, but it's gonna kind of go through more towards the middle here because that's where our 24-pin is located, and we can use these tie downs now, at least. Again, this is a nice feature of NZXT, right? I keep praising them. Maybe they'll sponsor one of my videos. All right, so coming through here like that, do is kind of just try to get it tucked through. We're just trying to tuck the cables through so we can work with them when we spin the case around. But I'm also trying to kind of just pin them down so that way they're not fighting me. So I'm just gonna get this one tied down real quick. All right, so what's next? We have tons of cables here still. So the great thing about this build here is we don't need any SATA power. Here's another SATA power cable. We don't need there's more SATA power. It's such a spaghetti mess right now. More SATA power and Molex. So none of this we need. So that is just gonna get stuffed. I see an empty drive bay here that we're not, again, gonna use. So kind of make them nice and accessible. Not really gonna tie them up too much really, because just in case the client ends up having to use them, they can easily get to them, but we're not going to leave them in the way. There we go. Easy peasy, and it's out of sight, so you can't even see it when everything's put back together. And then lastly, we have PCIe power. We're going to reserve this just in the back for now, because that'll be for our graphics card, which will be one of the very last steps that we do. So let's flip it around and get the 24-pin and the 8-pin power connected. We do have some fan cables here hanging out, which will connect. We might as well just go ahead and connect to the motherboard. So we'll run those, but let's do this real quick. All right, so easily we can see right here, we have the 24-pin just kind of hanging out. Now with this, there's a clip that will grab a notch on the motherboard. Typically that notch is facing outward, and it's easy to find that, just kind of feel around or look. So there's a big notch here that's hanging out that this clip will grab onto, and that'll basically secure the motherboard 24-pin power cable to the motherboard. This is why these cables are a pain, because now I gotta rotate it without it falling apart on me. There we go. This is honestly just simply lining up the holes, guys. So very simple. Try to get that extra 4-pin that's fighting me. But yeah, there we go. So now what I typically try to do is apply even pressure at the top and bottom of the cable. Got it going pretty good. Sometimes you can push from the back of the motherboard to help. Don't want to apply too much pressure, but what you're looking for is making sure that the cable is fully set in there. The clip will help you know and feel it, so we're good to go. NZXT provides this nice cable management bar, so that way this doesn't look too gaudy. Now, this is probably one of the harder ones to do, and sometimes people will actually do the CPU power or EPS power first, before they actually install the motherboard, because sometimes you don't have a lot of space to work with. But as we can see, same similar situation where there's a notch, but it's pointing up. So we need to get our clip side pointing up as well. So that means we have to rotate the cable, hopefully not skin our fingers while we're maneuvering around this cooler. This basically is impossible for you guys to see. That fan is in my way. So one thing to note about the NZXT case is when it comes with this pre-installed fan up top, that's nice and all, but in my case, getting in the way. So I need to get it off for a second just so I can get to the power cable that I'm struggling to get to. Ah, that's a lot better. So if you do get this case, you might want to take note of that. There we go. Now it's in there. And then kind of tuck your cable back a little bit off to the side, and in my case, put the fan back on. Alrighty guys, so we are nearing completion of this build, and really the only thing that we have left to do is my favorite part of any build, being installing the graphics card. So as you see here, we got a EVGA RTX 2060 Super. So let's get a little closer in here, show you guys how to get that installed, and we are basically nearing completion of this build. Alright guys, so since we have a little bit of room to work with before we put the video card in, I'm going to actually show you how to get the fans connected real quick. So as we mentioned, we got fan up top, fan in the back, and they're just a 3-pin, not a 4-pin PWM fan, but so we're just gonna basically grab power from the motherboard. So we have one that's run across from back of the chassis, and then one that's run down here somewhere from the top. So I wanna show you we're gonna get these connected before we get to the video card, so while we still have some space to work with. So I'm just gonna tidy this up a bit. Okay, on the motherboard we have some fan headers that are basically just on the other side of the motherboard tray. So I'm gonna run these 2 fan cables through to the other side, spin it around here so that we have both of them sticking out through here. And there are actually conveniently placed 3 fan headers right below the 24-pin power. So we're just gonna connect these guys so we have some power for these fans. This is a pretty convenient space to run these cables, and then we might pull a little zip tie on them to kind of tidy them up a little bit, but that looks pretty good right there. So next we'll move the chassis off to the side there for a second and get our video card opened up here and ready for install. Here we go. This guy out, set the box to the side. Very nice, and it definitely goes quite well with our theme, kind of being a black and gunmetal gray, silver-y look. There we go. Alrighty, this is a very nice looking card. Actually, it looks very similar to my 1080. So EVGA has kind of kept their graphics cards design relatively the same over the years, and so this looks really good. It is more of a budget-oriented graphics card, you know, being a 2060 Super. Things you can expect to not get, basically a back plate, which really not a big deal these days. And we just got an 8-pin power, not a dual 8-pin or 8+6 pin. So this will be plenty of gaming horsepower though for our rig. So let's get this guy installed. Alright guys, and to prep for the install of the video card, we're first gonna have to remove some expansion slots. And typically your very top expansion slot here is not utilized. Usually that's reserved for just a PCIe slot X1, but on this motherboard that doesn't even have that slot available. It's actually one underneath the video card. So we need to remove the second and the third slot because this is a dual slot video card. So let's get that underway here. In order to do that, NZXT again makes things kind of simple. So let's spin the case around here so you guys can see. There's some thumb screws here. Usually these are pretty tight from the factory, which they are. So we're gonna have to use the screwdriver to loosen them up, at least get them started. Wow, they're very tight. Okay, there was no spinning that off with my thumbs, that's for sure, but know that you can get these thumb tight after everything's said and done. So that'll slide this slot over, which will allow us to have something the video card to grab to. So then, like I said, we're gonna remove second and third slot here. So with our screwdriver, start working on that. That is also very tight. All right, easily to remove these, just they pop out after that screw's loosened up. So now what that does is it frees up that slot for us to slide in the video card. With our case, we have 3 PCIe slots. The top slot is typically the slot you want to shoot for installing a video card. It's gonna run at X16 speed. Sometimes you can get lucky with higher end boards and have a secondary X16 PCIe Express slot that will run at the same speed, but I don't typically recommend doing that. I mean, where you're really gonna need that is if you have a secondary video card, which which isn't very common these days anyway. So put it in your primary top slot always, and you shouldn't have any issues. So for installation of the video card's brand new, will come with a cover that is on the pins, the gold pins of where it inserts into the slot. And you'll notice, kind of like with the RAM and with the NVMe, there's also a cutout notch here that is going to line up with the area where we have that to mirror up with our PCIe slot. So really can only go in one way. And I'm going to leave the plastic wrap on it for now while we're got our hands all over it to kind of keep it nice and clean. But what you want to do is, first I would line up the bracket of the video card here, and it's going to basically tuck in between the very, very small tiny gap between the motherboard and the chassis. So first line that up, and actually sometimes we'll have an extra little thing to take off too. This was a cover that was on the top of the bracket. So line that up and then start pushing it towards the PCIe slot, which I'm doing here. Get it all lined up, and usually I put my hand on top of the chassis like this, or more towards the rear. Now I've got everything lined up, the notches are lining up, everything looks good. So now just give it a firm press. And that's what you want to hear, is just a click in. And for now, it's already kind of holding itself in because it's sitting on the metal part of the chassis plus the PCIe slot. So what we'll want to do here is to secure it completely, grab the screws that we backed off earlier from removing the expansion slot covers, screw those back in. And what I typically do with this part is I'll kind of push up on the video card with one finger, again, while we still have the plastic wrap on it, and tighten down those screws. Now we got one quite tight, and we can just zip in the other one. To show you guys what I did here is I basically tightened up these screws. Make sure they're pretty good and tight. You don't want any graphics card sag. Again, with the NZXT case, you have this little cover. We can slide it back over. Now we can tighten this down with our thumbs, because that's all it needs. This isn't really supporting anything. It's just kind of like a dust cover. It's not rattling. All right, GPU is installed, but there's one last remaining item. As we mentioned, we have an 8-pin power connector that we need to run. So we will flip our case back around. The power supply comes with two separate cables for power, and both of these actually are split to connect to either 6-pin or 8-pin together. We only need one of these cables. So I'm going to stuff the extra cable that we don't need where we stuffed the other cables previously. In case the client changes video cards down the line and decides to get a much more powerful one, they still have plenty of juice having 700 watts, and they have the cable that could allow them to use a video card that requires more power. So what we'll do with this is NZXT again has a pretty good little setup when it comes to running PCIe power. They have this nifty little cutout in the basement down here. We'll show you. And we can just run that cable straight up and into the video card. So what we'll do is I'll run that cable underneath in the basement, and I'll let you guys see as it kind of comes out of there. Okay, go. Spin it back into sight. And just like with any of the other power cables, they might be separated like this. Push them together because it's just made to be modular. And if your graphics card is a 6-pin or 8-pin or whatever, so you have plenty of pins to work with. And what we're gonna do is just kind of bend this over. Make sure you line up your notches with your clips. So the notch for the power is on the underside here where my finger is. I'm feeling it. And we got our clip that's gonna grab it, just like we did with the motherboard power cables, and just zip that guy right on in. There we go. And you should hear that click noise. And yeah, we do have this kind of gaudy looking power cable that is kind of just sticking out. What I typically do with that is I'll just bend it back and I'll put a small little zip tie on it, let it grab it like that, and it'll look pretty clean. So that is it. We've got all the major components installed. The last thing to do here is just to do some tidying up of the cables out back, which I'll do for you here. That's really kind of just based on preference, but I like to make my systems neat, so we're gonna spend a little bit of time just tidying things up back here. Alrighty guys, so we've got the PC fully assembled. Yes, I think I've said this in another video or many others. Don't put a PC together completely like I did, because you got to take something apart, you're going to have a big hassle doing that. So I don't recommend that, though. This was more, the reason I did it was to let you guys see the full process. So again, get it partially assembled, get your components tested, make sure you get a post, and then finish off the build. Here we go. First boot up, we got power here plugged into an outlet behind me, and we're going to plug into the power supply here on the rear of the PC. So that's as simple as just plugging it in. And then we're gonna flip the switch up on our power supply, which is to the line or the I symbol instead of the O meaning off. So flip that up. And we got keyboard sitting on top that we're gonna be mashing the delete key so we can get into BIOS. Here we go, 3, 2, 1, power. Here's some fans spinning up. I can't see anything really, but I'm gonna try to mash the delete key. Come on, baby. Don't fail me. We're good. So let's just see here. Okay, yep. In the ORIS BIOS screen, so we got a full post. We're looking good. That was actually relatively quick. Sometimes you might run into some boot loops that may occur that may just be simply like memory getting trained for the first time. So this thing is dead silent, and we still are maintaining our kind of stealth look. We don't have a lot of RGB going on, but very subtle yet sexy looking. So anyway, that about does it for the build process. Hopefully you guys found that informative. I hope I covered those steps for you guys in a way that you can now go take pretty much any PC for an example and make your own build out of it. It doesn't have to be exactly this. But as mentioned also in the first video too, we're gonna be doing the 3 parts of any build being part picking, building, and benchmarking. So all we have left to do now is some benchmarks, make sure this guy doesn't do any kind of crazy things like overheating, or we don't run into any kind of graphic anomalies or anything like that. So we'll get drivers installed, Windows installed, and off to the races with some benchmarks we go. So stay tuned for that. Alrighty guys, so there you have it. The $1,000 Ryzen gaming PC is now fully complete, fully benchmarked. We went over all the items, being how to pick out the parts to properly build a system like this, all the steps to get through with that. So I hope you enjoyed the 2-part video series that this has been. a little bit of a longer series, but I hope you gain something from this being something that you can take and go and build your own PC. And I'd have to say, I'm pretty impressed with this. It's a great little game room, and I really like the look of it because it's got that very stealth look to it. It's not very RGB crazy like my main rig behind it. So it was kind of fun doing this build, it's kind of a little different flavor of build that I normally do. It wasn't, extreme budget PC, and it didn't have all the RGB flair. It was strictly just raw performance. But other than that, guys, make sure you check out the description down below. I'll have links for all the parts that we did in this build and some possible variations as well that maybe you can use to copy this build exactly. I think right at the $1,000 mark is a pretty sweet spot for building up a gaming PC to really play all the modern titles at very good frame rates and definitely have a platform that you can upgrade over time. Other than that, guys, make sure you do the YouTube thing, right? Give me a like if you enjoyed this content, and let me know if this series was something that you enjoyed. I can definitely target some different budget ranges and kind of put something together similar. Hopefully that was informative for you, so that way you can go off and do your own build as well. Other than that, here's a couple other videos for you guys to go check out. Thanks for tuning into this one. I appreciate your time, and I'll catch you in the next one.